History often tells us that empires fall with a bang with thunderous battles, the clash of swords, and the roars of victorious kings. We imagine grand scenes of destruction, cities in flames, and armies marching. But what if the most devastating collapse wasn't loud at all? What if it was a slow, creeping silence that hollowed out a civilization from the inside? Today, we're going to explore a story that history books rarely tell in its entirety. It is the story of the women of the Inca Empire in a fate that many considered worse than death. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Andes in the 16th century, they brought with them steel, gunpowder, and horses. But they also brought something far more destructive, a worldview that sought to erase everything it could understand or control. For the millions living under Incan rule, this was the beginning of the end. But for the women of the Andes, the guardians of culture, family, and spirit, the conquest wasn't just a political takeover. It was an apocalypse of the soul. To understand their suffering, we first need to understand their world. Before the Spanish arrival, women in the Inca Empire held significant, respected roles. They weren't just wives and mothers. They were weavers, priestesses, healers, and agriculturalists. Their power was woven into the very fabric of society. The sacred feminine was everywhere. The moon, or Mama Kila, was a revered deity, the sister and wife of the sun god Inti. The earth itself, Pacham, was a nurturing mother goddess who provided for all. Women were her earthly representatives. Their ability to give birth mirrored the earth's ability to give life. This connection wasn't just symbolic, it was practical. Women managed household economies, held the rights to land, and passed down ancestral knowledge through intricate textile patterns that were like a written language. In Teast world, a woman's identity was tied to her community, her ancestors, and the sacred landscape around her. She belonged. Then, everything changed. The Spanish conquest was not simply a change of rulers. It was a violent collision of two completely different worlds. The invaders saw the Andes not as a sacred home, but as a source of gold and silver. They saw its people not as a complex civilization, but as souls to be converted and bodies to be exploited. And for the women, this new reality was a nightmare. One of the first and most brutal impacts was the breakdown of social structures that had protected them. The Spanish system, known as the Encomienda, granted conquistadors control over vast territories and the people living there. In practice, this was a system of forced labor, not far from slavery. Men were sent to work in the deadly silver mines of Potosi, often never to return. This left villages populated mainly by women, children, and the elderly. The women were now left to fend for themselves, to farm the land alone, and to hold their communities together against impossible odds. They became the sole providers and protectors in a world that was actively trying to tear them apart. But the violence wasn't just economic. It was deeply personal. Spanish men, thousands of miles from home and operating with a sense of total impunity, viewed indigenous women as spoils of war. The chronicles of the time are filled with accounts of widespread sexual violence. But beyond the horrific physical assaults, there was a calculated, systemic dismantling of the indigenous family. The Spanish imposed their own patriarchal ideals. They didn't recognize matrilineal lines of inheritance or the authority women held. Suddenly, a woman's worth was measured only by her relationship to a man, first her father, then her husband. Their traditional power was stripped away, legally and socially. They were rendered invisible in the new colonial order. Imagine being a weaver whose every thread told a story, a sacred pattern passed down from your grandmother. Now, you're told those patterns are demonic. Imagine being a priestess who speaks to the spirits of the mountains. Now, you're called a witch and threatened with torture or death. This was the spiritual warfare waged against the women of the Andes. The Catholic Church, in its quest to eradicate what it deemed paganism, targeted indigenous spirituality with ruthless efficiency. And women were often its primary keepers. They were the ones who led local rituals, who maintained the small shrines, or wakas, that dotted the landscape, and who remembered the ancient prayers. The Spanish priests saw this as a direct threat. They launched campaigns to extirpate idolatry, which meant burning sacred objects, destroying temples, and publicly punishing those who held on to their beliefs. Women were interrogated, shamed, and forced to confess their sins. Their spiritual practices, the very core of their identity and connection to their ancestors and their world, were demonized. They were forced to worship a foreign god in a foreign language, a god whose representatives had brought them nothing but misery. This was a form of psychological torture, being told that everything you and your ancestors have ever believed is evil. This brings us to the idea of a fate worse than death. For many of these women, physical death might have been a release. The life they were forced to live was a constant state of loss. It was the loss of safety, the loss of status, and the loss of family. But perhaps, most profoundly, it was the loss of meaning. Their gods were declared false, their traditions were banned, their knowledge was dismissed as superstition, and their language, Quechua, was suppressed. The conquest created a state of profound cultural homelessness. They were strangers in their own land. Even their children were turned against them. The Spanish established schools for the sons of indigenous nobility, where they were indoctrinated with Spanish language, religion, and culture. These children would then return to their communities as agents of the colonial power, sometimes even reporting their own mothers for practicing traditional rites. Can you imagine a deeper betrayal? To have your own child become an instrument of your culture's destruction. This is the slow, silent agony that hollowed out the Indian world. It wasn't a single battle. It was a daily struggle against erasure. It was being alive, but having the essence of who you are systematically killed. But this story is not just one of victimhood. It is also a story of incredible resilience. In the face of this overwhelming onslaught, the women of the Andes did not simply surrender, they resisted. Their resistance wasn't always fought with weapons. It was fought in secret, in the quiet corners of their homes and their hearts. They hid their sacred objects. They continued to whisper prayers to Pachamama while publicly reciting the Hail Mary. This is a phenomenon we now call syncretism. They cleverly blended their own beliefs with Catholicism, hiding their gods behind the masks of Christian saints. The Virgin Mary, for example, was often seen as a manifestation of Pachamama. In this way, they kept their spiritual world alive, hidden in plain sight. Their most powerful tool of resistance was the one thing they could always carry with them: memory, woven into their textiles. The weaving traditions continued. The patterns, the asterisk Palais asterisk, evolved to incorporate new elements, but they still carried the ancient codes, the stories of their people, the memory of a world before the conquest. A single piece of cloth became an act of defiance, a living library of a culture that refused to die. The mothers and grandmothers taught the young girls the patterns, ensuring that the knowledge would not be lost. Through storytelling, through ritual, through the simple act of weaving, they fought a silent, multi-generational war against forgetting. They were the anchors of their culture. While the men were taken away and the formal structures of the empire crumbled, the women held the line. They were the ones who ensured that being Indian still meant something. Today, centuries later, the legacy of these women is still vibrant in the Andes. When you see the colorful textiles of Peru and Bolivia, you are looking at a direct link to the women who endured the conquest. The languages of Quechua and Aymara are still spoken by millions, largely because mothers passed them down to their children. The deep reverence for Pachamama, for the sacred mountains, the asterisk, apos, asterisk, still endures. This survival is a testament to the strength of those who faced the unimaginable. They endured a fate worse than death, and doing so, they ensured their world would not die with them. Theirs is a story of profound suffering, yes, but it is ultimately a story of the enduring power of the human spirit to preserve what truly matters: identity, culture, and hope. Thank you so much for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. When Spanish ships first appeared on the horizon, reaching the shores of the vast Inca Empire, the people lining the coast had no words for what they were seeing. Imagine it. Enormous wooden structures floating on the water, bigger than any raft or boat they had ever known. From these strange vessels came men wearing shiny metal clothing that glinted in the sun, carting load thunderous weapons that could strike from a distance. And they brought with them foreign animals, creatures that looked like monsters from another world. For the women of the Inca Empire, This moment was filled with profound confusion and a deep, unsettling uncertainty. They were part of a society where life had a rhythm, a predictable order. Every person had a place, a defined role that contributed to the whole. Women were the backbone of their communities. They were farmers who coaxed life from the mountain terraces, mothers who nurtured the next generation, and priestesses who communed with the gods. They were master weavers, creating intricate textiles that were more valuable than gold. Healers who understood the secrets of the Andean plants, and the sacred keepers of ancient traditions. Life was structured, and within that structure, there was safety. But the sudden arrival of these strangers shattered that sense of order. Fear began to ripple through the communities. As the Spanish forces, led by men like Francisco P., started to move inland, villages watched their advance with a growing sense of dread. These weren't just visitors, they were invaders. The Spanish traveled with weapons of unprecedented power. Their arquebuses could kill from far away, spitting fire and smoke. They rode on the backs of horses, animals the Inca had never seen, which made the conquistadors look like towering, mythical centaurs, half man, half beast. With every step they took, they planted flags and claimed the land for a King Oshnozawag, for the Inca people, and especially for the women who were the heart of their communities. This was the beginning of a storm, a relentless tempest they could not stop. The Spanish did not arrive with open hands and offers of friendship. They came with an insatiable hunger, a burning desire for gold, silver, and total control. In their minds, their God was the only true God, and their religion was the only true faith. They were armed not just with steel, but with a conviction that their king had a divine right to rule any land they discovered. And they firmly believed that the Inca people, with their complex society and rich culture, should simply surrender to this new authority. For the women of the Inca Empire, the danger was more than just the physical threat of invasion. The more insidious, more terrifying threat was the loss of protection. In Inca society, women were not powerless. They were respected and integral members of the community. The asterisk, Ilu asterisk, they held rights, they had clearly defined roles, and they carried significant responsibilities. They could own land, inherit property, and even hold positions of leadership in their own right. But as the foreign invaders pushed deeper into their lands, the very systems that guaranteed their safety and status began to crack and break. Everything they depended on for security started to crumble. Their divine ruler, Tisapa Inca, was captured and held for an impossible ransom of gold and silver. Their bravest warriors, armed with maces and slings, were cut down by Spanish steel and cavalry charges. The ancient laws that had governed their lives for generations were cast aside and ignored by the newcomers. The arrival of the Spanish wasn't just a military encounter. It was the first decisive blow in a campaign to dismantle Gigich's entire way of life. The world of an Inca woman was one of balance, known as asterisk, any asterisk, or reciprocity. You gave, and you received. You cared for the community, and the community cared for you. This principle governed everything, from farming to family life. But the Spanish operated on a different principle, one of extraction and dominance. They saw the land not as a living entity to be respected, but as a resource to be exploited. They saw the people not as equals, but as subjects to be converted and controlled. As the conquest unfolded, the lives of Inca women were thrown into chaos. Villages were torn apart. Men were conscripted into forced labor in the newly established silver mines, leaving women to manage fields and families alone. The traditional social fabric, woven over centuries, was being unraveled thread by thread. The Spanish brought with them not only soldiers, but also priests who saw the Incas' spiritual beliefs as devil worship. Sacred sites were desecrated, and a new religion was imposed, often by force. For women who were priestesses, the guardians of a spiritual world Taman held sacred, this was a devastating blow. Their connection to the divine, a source of their power and identity, was being severed. The physical danger was also immediate and personal. Without the protection of their warriors and their social structures, women became vulnerable to the violence and whims of the conquistadors. The invaders saw them as spoils of war, another resource to be taken. This was a violation not just of their bodies, but of their very being, a rejection of the respect and status they had held in their own society. The clash of cultures was brutal and unforgiving. Imagine a young woman who had been chosen to be an asterisk Akla. Asterisk, one of the chosen women who lived in seclusion, weaving fine cloth for the Sapa Inca and performing sacred rituals. Her life was one of honor and privilege. Suddenly, her temple is invaded, her world is turned upside down, and she is faced with men who do not understand or respect her sacred role. Her purpose, her entire reason for being, is erased in an instant. Or think of a matriarch, the head of a large family, who once managed her household's land and resources with authority. Now, she watches as her sons are taken away, her land is seized, and her authority is rendered meaningless. This period was a profound trauma. The Spanish conquest was not a clean, swift event. It was a messy, brutal, and prolonged process of subjugation. But it's crucial to understand that the women of the Inca Empire were not passive victims. They were resilient. They resisted in countless ways, both overt and subtle. Some fought alongside the men in the rebellions that flared up against Spanish rule. Others resisted by preserving their culture in secret. They continued to speak their language, Quechua, in hushed tones. They wove traditional symbols and stories into the textiles they were forced to create for their new masters, a hidden transcript self-ager of their identity. They passed down their oral histories, their myths, and their knowledge of the land to their children, ensuring that the soul of their culture would not be extinguished. They adapted. They navigated the treacherous new world they found themselves in, learning to deal with the Spanish authorities, to protect their families, and to carve out new spaces for themselves in a society that was fundamentally hostile to their existence. The story of the Inca women during the conquest is not just a tale of loss and suffering. It is also a testament to their incredible strength, the adaptability, and their enduring spirit. They were the keepers of the flame, the ones who ensured that even in the darkest of times, the legacy of the Inca civilization would survive. Their story is a powerful reminder that even when empires fall, the will to preserve one's culture and identity can endure against all odds. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the lesser-known corners of history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, have you ever wondered what happens when the heart of an empire is ripped out? In 1532, the Spanish did just that. They captured Atahualpa, the last Sapa Inca, the divine emperor of the Inca Empire. This single act wasn't just a military victory. It was a psychological earthquake that shattered the world of millions, and its aftershocks were felt most profoundly by the women of the empire. To understand why, you have to realize that the Sapa Inca wasn't just a king. He was the center of their universe, a living god who maintained cosmic balance. His presence guaranteed the rising of the sun, the coming of the rains, and the fertility of the earth. He was the ultimate protector, the father of his people. His capture was like telling everyone the sun might not rise tomorrow. For Inca women, who were the custodians of family, community, and tradition, this was a terrifying prospect. Imagine you're an Inca woman living in a peaceful village high in the Andes. Your life is governed by ancient cycles and rituals. You weave intricate textiles that tell the stories of your ancestors. You tend to the fields that feed your family, and you honor the sacred spirits of the mountains. Your world is stable, predictable. The Sapa Inca, though distant, is the anchor of this stability. His well-being is directly tied to yours. Then, a runner arrives, breathless, with terrifying news. The Sapa Inca has been taken by strange, bearded men with metal skin and thunder sticks. They hold him captive in a distant city called Cajamarca. The anchor is gone. The world is suddenly adrift. This news travels like a virus from village to village, spreading not just information, but a deep, primal fear. For the women, the questions were immediate and agonizing. Who would now ensure the harvests? Who would protect their children? Who would uphold the sacred laws that govern their lives? The social fabric of the empire was woven around the divine authority of the Inca. With him gone, that fabric began to unravel thread by thread. The Spanish, led by Francisco Pizarro, were cunning. They understood the power they held. By imprisoning Atahualpa, they held the entire empire hostage. They didn't need to conquer every single village and fight every warrior. They had captured the empire's soul. Atahualpa himself, trying to save his own life and his people, ordered his generals not to attack. He believed he could ransom his freedom. The empire, in a state of shock and confusion, obeyed. This period of paralysis was devastating. The command structure was broken. Local leaders, known as Caracas, didn't know whether to fight, flee, or surrender. The Spanish exploited this confusion brilliantly. They sent messages promising safety and order if communities submitted. Too many, especially women desperate to protect their families from bloodshed, surrender seemed like the only logical choice. They believed that by accepting Spanish authority, they could preserve some semblance of their lives. It was a tragic miscalculation. Surrender did not bring peace. It brought a new, insidious form of chaos. Once a town yielded, Spanish soldiers and officials moved in. They were not benevolent rulers. They saw the Inca world as a treasure chest to be plundered. They demanded gold, silver, food, and labor. The old laws that had protected Inca society, especially its women, were swept aside. Suddenly, an Inca woman's world was turned upside down. The temples where she prayed to the moon goddess, Mama Hila, were desecrated or closed. The sacred rituals she performed to ensure a good harvest were forbidden, labeled as pagan idolatry. The community lands that had been cultivated for generations were seized by Spanish Inca, who were granted the right to demand tribute and labor from the native population. This new system was brutal. Men were often forced into grueling, deadly work in silver mines, sometimes for months or years at a time. This left women to manage the fields, raise the children, and care for the elderly all on their own. The very structure of the family, the core of Inca society, was fractured. Worse still, women lost the legal and social protections they once had. Under Inca law, their roles were clearly defined and respected. Now, they were at the mercy of foreign men who viewed them not as people, but as spoils of war. Spanish soldiers and colonists asserted a grim authority, and the stories of abuse and exploitation are a dark chapter in this history. Women were forced into servitude, their bodies and their labor claimed by the conquerors. Think about the psychological toll. Your gods have been declared false. Your sacred spaces have been defiled. Your husband has been taken away to a mine he may never return from. Your leaders are powerless, and your community is governed by armed strangers who do not speak your language or respect your customs. This wasn't just a political takeover. It was the systematic dismantling of an entire way of life, an entire identity. But the women of the Inca Empire were not passive victims. They resisted in countless ways, both big and small. They secretly continued their rituals, whispering prayers to their old gods. They hid sacred objects from the Spanish. They taught their children the old stories and songs in their native Quechua, preserving their language and culture against all odds. They used their knowledge of textiles to weave new patterns that subtly encoded messages of defiance and memory. These acts of cultural preservation were acts of war fought on a different battlefield. While men fought with weapons, women fought with memory. They became the living libraries of a world that was being erased. They understood that if the stories, the language, and the traditions died, then the Inca would truly be lost forever. The capture of Atahualpa was the single blow that broke the empire's spine. But the slow, agonizing collapse that followed was experienced most intimately in the daily lives of its women. They witnessed the death of their world, not on a battlefield, but in their homes, their fields, and their hearts. They were forced to navigate a new reality of fear, loss, and oppression. Yet, through it all, they endured. They became the guardians of a flame that the Spanish tried desperately to extinguish. The resilience of Andean culture today, the vibrant traditions that still thrive in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, is a direct testament to the strength of these women. They were the ones who held the broken pieces of their world together, who ensured that the spirit of the Inca would survive long after the last emperor was gone. Their story is a powerful reminder that the fall of an empire is never just about kings and conquerors. It's about the ordinary people whose lives are shattered, and about the extraordinary courage they find to rebuild. The women of the Inca Empire lost their protector, but in doing so, they were forced to become protectors themselves. Protectors of a legacy that lives on to this day. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as moving as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden histories from around the world. See you next time. For the Spanish conquistadors, Simply conquering the land of the Inca Empire was not their ultimate goal. No, their ambition ran deeper. They wanted to conquer the very souls of the people. Interize, the Inca religion, with its deep reverence for the sacred mountains, the sun, the moon, and the ancestral spirits, was fundamentally wrong. They saw it as heresy, a collection of false beliefs that needed to be eradicated. And so, a new kind of conquest began, a spiritual one, with Inca women at its very center. The Spanish began by systematically dismantling the Inca spiritual world, majestic temples, places where generations had gathered to honor their gods, were turned dune. In their place, Christian churches were erected, built often from the very stones of the sacred sites they replaced. This wasn't just an architectural change. It was a powerful statement of dominance. Imagine the psychological shock. Imagine watching the holy ground where your grandmother once prayed being desecrated and rebuilt into a symbol of a foreign faith. Priests, armed with religious doctrine and colonial authority, ordered Inca women to abandon their ancient ceremonies and rituals. This was a devastating blow because women held vital roles within the Inca religious system. They were revered as priestesses, entrusted with the care of sacred fires that were never meant to be extinguished. They were the keepers of ancient songs, the oral historians who passed down the stories of their people. They were the weavers of intricate textiles that held cosmic and spiritual significance. Suddenly, these women, who had been pillars of their spiritual community, were told that their beliefs were not just wrong, but evil. The gods they had grown up honoring were now labeled as demons. The rituals that had brought their communities together for harvests, births, and deaths were forbidden. It was a profound and deeply personal attack, a form of psychological warfare that aimed to sever them from their own identity. This wasn't just about changing beliefs. It was about inducing a sense of shame for everything they had ever held sacred. The pain was immeasurable, a wound inflicted not on the body, but on the soul. The Spanish implemented a systematic campaign to erase Inca identity. This cultural destruction was carried out through strict, unyielding rules. Women were forced to learn new prayers in a language they didn't understand, reciting words that felt hollow and foreign. They were compelled to learn Spanish, a linguistic tool of the colonizers, further distancing them from their native Quechua. Their traditional clothing, vibrant textiles that told stories of lineage and place, were deemed inappropriate, and they were pressured to adopt Spanish dress. The pressure was relentless, touching every aspect of their lives. How they worshipped, how they married, even how they raised their children all came under the scrutiny and control of the new regime. Many women, facing overwhelming force and the threat of severe punishment, had no choice but to obey. They outwardly conformed, attending church and reciting the catechism. But for many, this compliance was a mask. Survival depended on it. Behind closed doors, in the quiet corners of their homes and communities, a silent rebellion was taking shape. Women became the secret guardians of their heritage. They found ingenious ways to preserve their traditions, hiding them in plain sight. The art of weaving, for instance, transformed. While a textile might appear to have adopted Spanish motifs on the surface, a closer look would reveal ancient Inca symbols cleverly embedded within the paternza, llama, a condor, a sacred mountain. The threads themselves became a form of coded language, a defiant act of cultural memory. Songs, too, became vessels of survival. A simple melody sung while grinding corn could carry double meanings, recounting tales of Inca gods, or lamenting the loss of their world, all under the unsuspecting ears of the Spanish overseers. Stories told to children at bedtime were not just simple fables. They were carefully curated lessons in identity, passing down the core values and beliefs of their ancestors in a way that could be easily detected or policed. These acts of quiet resistance were lifelines. They were small but powerful affirmations that shouted, "We are still here. We remember." The cultural destruction was not a single, violent event. It was a slow, suffocating process, a gradual drowning in a sea of foreign customs and beliefs. It was a forced forgetting, a systematic stripping away of everything that defined who they were as a people. For many Inca women, this loss was a fate worse than death. Culture wasn't an abstract concept. It was life itself. It was the intricate web of relationships, that made up their families and communities. It was the shared memories that gave them a past, and the collective rituals that gave them a future. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire is often told through tales of grand battles and fallen kings. But for the millions of ordinary people, especially women, the end of the war was just the beginning of a different, more insidious kind of suffering. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of the most devastating systems. The Spanish introduced the Encomienda. Officially, the Encomienda was presented as a benevolent system. The Spanish crown claimed it was a way to protect and educate the native people, to bring them into the fold of Christianity and Spanish civilization. But the reality was far darker. In practice, the Encomienda was nothing short of legalized slavery. Imagine this. A Spanish conquistador, as a reward for his service, is granted an Encomienda. This didn't just give him a plot of land, it gave him control over entire indigenous communities. He became the de facto owner of the land, the resources, and most cruelly, the people living on it. For the women of the once mighty Inca Empire, this system turned their world into a living nightmare. Before the conquest, Inca women held vital roles in their society. They were weavers, farmers, healers, and community leaders. Their lives were structured, their contributions valued. The Encomienda shattered that world. Suddenly, these women were forced into servitude, their days filled with relentless, back-breaking labor. They carried heavy loads for their new Spanish masters, their backs aching under the strain. They were forced into domestic service, cooking for Spanish households, cleaning homes that weren't theirs, and washing clothes for people who saw them as less than human. They toiled in the fields, cultivating crops on land that had belonged to their ancestors for generations, but was now the property of a stranger. The work was endless. From before sunrise until after sunset, there was no rest. There was no pay. There was only constant work, performed under the ever-present threat of punishment. The physical exhaustion was immense, but the psychological toll was just as severe. One of the most brutal aspects of the Encomienda was the deliberate separation of families. A mother could be assigned to one landowner, while her husband and children were sent to another, miles away. Communities were fractured, kinship ties severed. Imagine the constant, gnawing pain of a mother not knowing where her children were, if they were safe, if they were hungry, or if she would ever see them again. For many, that reunion never came. The family, the core of Inca society, was systematically dismantled. To enforce this brutal system, the Spanish relied on fear and violence. Any woman who resisted, who dared to slow her pace, or who refused an order, faced harsh consequences. Punishments were swift and public, designed to humiliate and intimidate everyone else into submission. Threats were a part of daily life. But the cruelty wasn't just physical. It was a relentless, psychological assault. The Spanish colonizers, through their actions and their words, hammered home a message of inferiority. The Inca people were told that their sophisticated culture was worthless. Their beliefs were demonic, and their language was primitive. Every day, women were stripped of their dignity, their identity, and their sense of self. This constant humiliation was a powerful tool of control, designed to break their spirits. The living conditions under the Encomienda were appalling. With the men often forced to work in distant silver mines, the burden of sustaining what was left of the community fell on the women. Food was scarce, as the best of the harvest went to the Spanish. Hunger became a constant companion. Exhaustion was a permanent state of being. Diseases, some new and some exacerbated by malnutrition and overwork, swept through the communities. The vibrant, thriving mountain villages that had once lived in harmony with the Pachamama Mother Earth were now gripped by fear and despair. Their every move watched by Spanish overseers. And yet, in the face of this overwhelming oppression, the spirit of Inca women did not completely break. Resistance took many forms, most of it quiet, subtle, and incredibly brave. It was a resistance of survival. When the overseer's back was turned, a woman might intentionally slow her work, a small act of defiance that reclaimed a moment of her time. While working in the fields, groups of women would sing old songs, their voices carrying ancient melodies across the stolen land, weaving a thread of cultural continuity in the face of erasure. They passed down stories and traditions in hushed tones, keeping the memory of their world alive. In secret, they would hide sacred objects, small carvings, woven textiles with traditional patterns away from the prying eyes of priests who sought to destroy all traces of their religion. Perhaps the most powerful act of resistance was linguistic. Despite demands that they learn and speak Spanish, mothers and grandmothers secretly taught their children Quichua, the language of their ancestors. In teaching the language, they were passing on an entire worldview, a way of understanding the universe that was profoundly different from that of their oppressors. Each whispered Quechua word was a victory. These small, persistent acts of cultural preservation they were how the Inca people endured. They ensured that even after generations of oppression, the core of their identity was not extinguished. The Encomienda system officially lasted for centuries, and its devastating effects lingered for much longer. For the women of the Andes, it was a slow, grinding process of loss. It was the loss of freedom, the loss of family, the loss of culture, and the loss of security. It systematically dismantled the social fabric that had held their communities together for 1,000 years. It inflicted deep, generational trauma, the echoes of which are still felt today. The story of the Encomienda is a harsh reminder that the consequences of conquest are not just about battles won and lost. They are about the lives shattered in the aftermath, the silent suffering of millions, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable hardship. The quiet resistance of Inca women is a testament to their strength, a story that deserves to be remembered and honored. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story important, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more hidden histories. See you next time. When we talk about the fall of the Inca Empire, we often focus on the epic battles, the fallen kings, and the vast quantities of gold. But there's a quieter, more personal story of conquest that is often overlooked. Story of cultural destruction that struck at the very heart of the family. For countless Inca women, the deepest, most enduring wound wasn't inflicted by swords or disease, but by the systematic dismantling of their children's identity. This pain wasn't about what happened to them, but what was stolen from the next generation. Imagine this. Spanish authorities, fresh from their military victories, established schools across the former empire. On the surface, the mission sounded noble, even benevolent. They were going to civilize the indigenous children. They would teach them the ways of a modern world, introduce them to Christianity, and give them the tools to thrive in this new colonial society. But beneath this veneer of progress lay a far more sinister agenda. These schools were not instruments of education. They were weapons of cultural erasure. The process was brutally simple. Children, some barely old enough to remember their own names, were forcibly taken from their homes. They were torn from the arms of their mothers and fathers, separated from their communities, and plunged into a completely alien world. These weren't boarding schools as we might think of them today. They were indoctrination centers, meticulously designed to strip away every last trace of their heritage. The first thing to go was their language. Quechua, the tongue of their ancestors, the language of their lullabies and bedtime stories, was forbidden. Speaking it was punished. Instead, they were forced to learn Spanish, the language of their conquerors. Their minds were filled with new words, while the old ones were left to wither and die on their lips. The beautiful, complex tapestry of their native beliefs was unraveled. The spiritual world, they knew the reverence for the mountains, the sun. The earth was labeled as paganism, as devil worship. Their gods were branded as false idols, their rituals as primitive superstitions. They were taught that everything they had ever known, everything their parents had ever taught them, was wrong. In place of their rich traditions, Spanish customs were presented as the pinnacle of civilization. Their colorful, hand-woven textiles were replaced with somber European clothes. Their traditional foods were dismissed in favor of Spanish cuisine. Their songs, their dances, their stories passed down through generations all were deemed inferior, something to be ashamed of and forgotten. The goal was clear: to sever the connection between the child and their past, to create a generation that would not only accept Spanish rule but actively embrace it, seeing their own culture as something to be despised. For the Inca mothers left behind, the silence in their homes was deafening. They watched, powerless, as their children were molded into strangers. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. And then, one day, a child might return. But the child who came back was not the one who had been taken. Can you even begin to imagine that pain? Imagine raising a child, pouring your love, your hopes, your entire world into them for years. You teach them the stories of your ancestors, the songs of your people, the very rhythm of your life, and then they are taken. When they return, they speak a language you cannot understand. They look at you with eyes that no longer recognize the world you share. They hesitate when you offer them the food they once loved. The connection you once had, the most fundamental bond between a mother and child, is fractured by a wall of foreign words and ideas. Imagine hearing your own child, your own flesh and blood, tell you that the traditions you hold sacred are foolish. Imagine them reciting prayers to a foreign god while looking down on the spirits your family has honored for centuries. Imagine the confusion and shame in their eyes when you try to sing them an old lullaby, and they can't remember the words. This wasn't just a loss of culture. It was the loss of a child, even while they stood right in front of you. They were physically present, but their spirit, their identity, had been colonized. This was a unique and devastating form of psychological warfare. It was a grief that never ended. For many of these women, this slow, agonizing erosion of their family and culture was a fate worse than death. Death, at least, brings an end to suffering. But this suffering was renewed every single day. It was there in every awkward conversation, in every shared meal that felt more like a negotiation than a family gathering. It was present every time a mother saw the conflict in her child as the struggle between the world they were born into and the world they were being forced to accept. Every time a child rejected the foods, the songs, or the stories of their people, it was another small death for the family. The children themselves were victims, caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. They became unwilling tools of colonization, living proof of the supposed superiority of Spanish culture. Their very existence was used to validate the colonial project, to show other indigenous people that resistance was futile and assimilation was the only path forward. And the mothers, they were left with a silent, suffocating grief. A grief they couldn't always articulate, because it was for something that was both lost and still there. How do you mourn a child who is still alive? How do you explain the ache in your soul when you look at your family and realize that the line of your ancestors, the chain of knowledge and tradition, has been deliberately and irrevocably broken? Imagine an empire woven together not just by roads and stone, but by threads of heritage, passed down from mother to daughter. This was the world of the Inca, a civilization where family lines were the very foundation of society. In this world, women weren't just members of a family. They were the living libraries of their people. They held the patterns of intricate weavings, the secrets of healing plants, the wisdom of planting and harvesting, and the sacred stories of the ancestors. Each woman was a vital link in an unbroken chain stretching back through generations, connecting the present to the past. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Andes, they didn't just seek gold and land. They sought to dismantle this entire way of life, and they knew exactly where to strike. at the heart of the family, at the women who carried its heritage. The conquest wasn't just a military campaign. It was a systematic assault on identity. The very first act of this cultural erasure was the stripping away of names. A woman's Inca name was a story in itself, a connection to her lineage and her place in the cosmos. Suddenly, she was forced to take a Spanish name, a foreign sound that held no meaning, no history, no connection to her ancestors. It was like erasing the title of a sacred book. Next came the assault on their appearance. The vibrant, symbolic clothing of the Andes, textiles that told stories of one's community, status, and beliefs, were outlawed. Women were forced into restrictive, European-style dresses. This wasn't just a change of fashion. It was a visual severing of their identity. They looked in the mirror and no longer saw an Andean woman, a daughter of the mountains. They saw a reflection of their conquerors. Their own language, Quichua, the tongue of their mothers and grandmothers, was suppressed. They were punished for speaking the words that had shaped their world, forced to adopt the language of those who sought to control them. The Spanish understood that to control a people, you must first break their social structure. Women who held respected titles and positions of authority within their communities were stripped of them. Their roles as leaders, healers, and keepers of tradition were declared invalid. They were told they no longer belonged to their own people, that their lineage meant nothing. The Spanish didn't just ignore the existing social order. They actively rewrote it. Entire noble families, people descended from kings and queens, were reclassified. Women from the most respected bloodlines, who once commanded deference and held significant influence, were suddenly treated as commoners, or worse, as servants in their own land. This wasn't just it was the complete theft of their identity. In Andean culture, your identity, your connection to your family, your ancestors, your community, was sacred. It was who you were. To have that torn away was a spiritual death. Imagine being told that everything you are, everything your mother and grandmother were, is now worthless. Imagine your heritage being declared a lie. This created a profound and invisible wound. When a woman's identity is destroyed, her connection to the past is severed. The thread she holds is cut, and when that thread breaks, the entire cultural tapestry begins to unravel. This loss was a unique and devastating form of suffering. It wasn't a physical injury that could be seen and treated. It was an internal agony, a cultural death that lived deep inside the hearts of these women. They were forced to navigate a world where they could no longer recognize themselves or their place in it. This forced erasure, this deliberate campaign to make an entire people forget who they were, was one of the most brutal and lasting legacies of the conquest. It was a war fought not on a battlefield, but in the minds and souls of the women who were the keepers of a civilization. But the story doesn't end with destruction. The spirit of the Andes is resilient. Even in the face of such overwhelming pressure, the threads of culture were not entirely broken. Secretly, in the quiet corners of their homes, away from the watchful eyes of the colonizers, women continued to whisper the old stories to their children. They wove secret symbols into their textiles, hiding their ancestral patterns within the designs forced upon them. They held on to the healing knowledge, passing it down in hushed tones. They preserved their identity not in grand monuments, but in the small, defiant acts of everyday life. These women became masters of resistance through preservation. They understood that if they could keep the flame of their culture alive, even as a tiny ember, it could one day be fanned back into a blaze. They encoded their history, their beliefs, and their identity into the very fabric of their new, imposed lives. A weaving pattern might look like a simple floral design to a Spaniard, but to the woman who made it and the community who saw it, it was a map of their cosmos, a tribute to a mountain deity, a memory of a forgotten ritual. The Spanish could change their names and their clothes, but they could not completely extinguish the fire within. This incredible story of cultural survival continues to this day. The descendants of these women are now leading a powerful cultural renaissance across the Andes. They are reclaiming their ancestral names, reviving ancient weaving techniques, and speak in their native languages with pride. They are unearthing the stories that were hidden and sharing them with the world. They are healing the wound of cultural erasure by reweaving the broken threads of their heritage, connecting the present not only to the past, but to a vibrant and self-determined future. The women of the Andes are teaching us a powerful lesson. that even when a culture is targeted for destruction, the human spirit, anchored in identity and heritage, can find a way to endure, to resist, and ultimately, to flourish once more. Thank you for watching. If you found this story powerful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more hidden histories. Your support helps us continue to share these important stories. Did you know that in the Spanish colonial empire, marriage wasn't about love? It was a weapon, a powerful tool used to control entire populations. Today, we're redelving into a side of history that is often overlooked: the strategic use of arranged marriages to dominate Andean communities, and the devastating impact it had on the women caught in the middle. Imagine this. You're a young woman living in a vibrant Andean community. Your life is rich with tradition, spiritual beliefs, and a deep connection to your land and people. In your culture, marriage is a sacred bond. It's an alliance between families, celebrated with blessings, community feasts, and rituals that have been passed down for generations. It's about partnership, shared values, and strengthening the bonds that hold your society together. Then, everything changes. Foreign invaders, the Spanish conquistadors, arrive. They don't just conquer with swords and cannons. They conquer with laws, religion, and social engineering. And one of their most effective tools is the institution of marriage itself. Suddenly, your future is no longer your own. Spanish authorities begin to orchestrate unions, pairing you and other women from your community, not based on love, affection, or even family compatibility, but on cold, hard political and economic interests. These weren't romantic unions. They were strategic transactions designed to consolidate Spanish power. How did this work? It was a systematic dismantling of the existing social structure. By forcing marriages, the Spanish could gain access to land, resources, and labor that were traditionally controlled by indigenous families and communities. A marriage to an indigenous woman, especially one from a noble lineage, could grant a Spanish man legitimacy and control over vast territories and the people who lived there. The woman became a bridge, a key that unlocked the wealth of her people for the colonizers. For the women, this was a profound violation. Their value was no longer measured by their skills, their wisdom, or their role within their own society. Instead, their worth was determined by how useful they were to the colonial project. A woman's body and her future became bargaining chips in a political game she had no say in. The freedom to choose a partner, a fundamental human right we often take for granted, was stripped away. Think about the psychological weight of this. You're forced into a union with a stranger, a man from a different culture who likely doesn't speak your language or understand your beliefs. You're often moved away from your home, your family, your entire support system. You're isolated, living under a new set of rules you never agreed to, and expected to conform to a foreign culture's idea of what a wife should be. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a community-wide crisis. The traditional Inca concept of marriage, known as servanakai, often involved a trial period where a couple lived together to ensure compatibility before making a permanent commitment. It was a practical and respectful approach to partnership. The Spanish, however, saw this as immoral and replaced it with their rigid, indissoluble Catholic marriage. This new model served their purpose perfectly. Once a marriage was sealed, the property and power transfers were permanent. These forced unions created new social hierarchies. Women found themselves trapped in a complex and confusing colonial caste system, or sistema de caste. Your identity was no longer simply Andean. It was now defined by your relationship to a Spanish man and the racial category assigned to your children. This created divisions within communities that had once been unified. People were pitted against each other, and the social fabric began to unravel. The loneliness and confusion must have been immense. These women experienced a profound loss of identity and purpose. Their spiritual beliefs were suppressed, their traditions were mocked, and their lives were dictated by foreign laws and expectations. It was a slow breaking of the spirit, a form of control that went far deeper than physical force. It aimed to conquer the very heart and soul of a culture. And yet, despite this immense pressure, the story doesn't end with complete submission. Many Andean women found ways to resist. They secretly maintained their traditions, taught their children their native language and beliefs, and used their positions in these new households to subtly influence events and protect their communities. They navigated these treacherous waters with incredible resilience, preserving fragments of their culture against all odds. Their stories are a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming oppression. When we study history, it's easy to focus on the big battles and the famous leaders, but the real story often lies in the quiet, personal struggles of everyday people. The experience of these Andean women reveals the true nature of colonialism. It wasn't just a political or military takeover. It was an intimate invasion, one that sought to control the most personal aspects of life: love, family, and identity. By understanding this, we gain a much deeper appreciation for the true cost of conquest and the incredible resilience of those who endured it. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a crucial but often forgotten part of history. If you found this story as powerful as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content that uncovers the hidden stories of our past. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. See you next time. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to have your entire world, your beliefs, your very identity, stolen from you? Let's travel back in time, before the Spanish arrived in the Andes, to a world where women held positions of immense power and sacred duty within the Inca Empire. Imagine a group of women known as the A-class, the chosen women. These weren't just any women. They were selected at a young age for their exceptional skill, their sharp minds, their discipline, and their spiritual purity. They lived in special temples, the Aklawasi, and their lives were dedicated to the gods and the empire. They were masters of their craft, weaving intricate ceremonial cloths so fine it was considered a gift from the heavens. They brewed the sacred chicha for religious festivals, prepared offerings for the Sapa Inca, and, most importantly, they were the keepers of the sacred fires. These fires were never allowed to go out, symbolizing the eternal life and power of the sun god Inti and the Inca state itself. Their roles were not just jobs. They were holy callings. The A-class were deeply respected, seen as intermediaries between the human and divine realms. They were the spiritual heart of the empire, and their work ensured cosmic balance and prosperity for all. Their lives had profound meaning and purpose. Then, everything changed. In the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors arrived, driven by greed for gold and a fervent desire to spread their own religion. The Inca Empire, weakened by civil war and disease, fell, and with its fall came the systematic destruction of an entire way of life. For the A-class and other women in sacred roles, this was a cataclysm. The Spanish saw their temples not as holy places, but as sites of pagan worship. Temples were looted, torn down, or converted into Catholic churches. The sacred fires, which had burned for generations, were unceremoniously extinguished. The vibrant, complex rituals they had dedicated their lives to were banned, dismissed as idolatry and witchcraft. Suddenly, the women who had been revered for their spiritual purpose were told their work was meaningless, even evil. Their sacred identity, the very core of who they were, was stripped away. Can you imagine the emotional devastation? Their entire sense of self-worth, their value in society, was tied to traditions that were now forbidden under penalty of severe punishment. These honored women were reduced to the status of common laborers or domestic servants for the Spanish colonizers. The intricate weaving skills that were once prized were now used to make cloth for their new masters. The knowledge of herbs, rituals, and astronomy they possessed was ignored, even feared. Losing a sacred role isn't just like losing a job. It's like having your soul's purpose ripped out. This was a profound, invisible wound, a form of suffering that left deep emotional scars on generations of women. But the conquest wasn't just physical. It was a psychological war, and religion became one of the most powerful weapons. Spanish priests, convinced of their own righteousness, saw it as their duty to save the indigenous people from their false beliefs. They used fear as a primary tool to break the spirit and confidence of entire communities. They preached terrifying sermons about eternal hellfire and damnation. They introduced the concept of confession, forcing people to reveal their innermost thoughts and private rituals, which were then condemned as sins. Women, often the keepers of cultural knowledge and tradition, were specifically targeted. They were accused of practicing witchcraft and communicating with demons. Think about the psychological torture of this. You're told that your beloved ancestors, whom you've always believed watch over and guide you, are now damned, suffering in a Christian hell. You are retold that the sacred rituals you perform to honor the earth and bring a good harvest will actually bring evil upon your family. You're retold that the sacred objects passed down through your family for generations are now cursed idols that must be destroyed. This created an intense and unbearable inner conflict. Imagine holding onto the faith of your ancestors in your heart while being forced to kneel before the cross. Imagine being torn between loyalty to your culture and the very real fear of brutal punishment or even death for disobedience. This constant pressure created a pervasive atmosphere of guilt, fear, and confusion. Many women fought back in the only way they could, in secret. They continued to pray to their mountain gods, the Apis, and to Pachamama, the Earth Mother. They hid their sacred objects and performed their rituals in the dead of night, away from the watchful eyes of the priests. This quiet resistance was an act of incredible courage, but the constant need for secrecy, the constant fear of being discovered, took its toll. It weakened them emotionally, creating a split within their own minds. This battle for the hearts and minds of the Inca women was one of the cruelest and most enduring forms of suffering inflicted by the conquest. It was a war fought not on a battlefield, but within the soul. And the echoes of that struggle can still be felt in the Andes today, a testament to the resilience of a people who refused to let their spirit be extinguished. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story powerful, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more hidden histories. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. When we think of the fall of the Inca Empire, we often picture epic battles, fallen kings, and conquered cities. We imagine a clash of steel, the roar of cannons, and the collapse of a civilization under the weight of Spanish ambition. But what if I told you the most powerful form of resistance wasn't fought on a battlefield? What if the true story of survival was quieter, more subtle, and led by the very people history often forgets? Today, we're going to uncover the story of the Inca women and how their silent, determined acts of defiance kept the soul of their culture alive against impossible odds. This isn't just a story of oppression. It's a story of incredible strength, memory, and the enduring power of tradition. Imagine your world turned upside down. Your gods are declared false. Your language is forbidden. Your traditions are deemed savage. The Spanish conquest was not just a military victory. It was an attempt to systematically erase an entire way of life. Temples were torn down, golden artifacts were melted into coins, and leaders were executed. For the Inca people, it was a cataclysm. In this new, brutal world, open rebellion was often a death sentence. So, how do you fight back when you've lost everything? The Inca women found an answer. Their resistance wasn't waged with swords and spears, but with whispers, threads, and memories. It began in the home, the one space they could still control. While the men were forced into labor in mines and on plantations, the women became the secret guardians of Inca identity. One of their most powerful weapons was language. The Spanish imposed their own tongue, but in the quiet corners of their homes, mothers and grandmothers taught their children Quechua. It was spoken in soft tones, almost a whisper, a secret code that connected them to their ancestors and to each other. Every word was an act of defiance, a quiet declaration that their world had not vanished. It was a promise that the next generation would know who they were. Then there was the weaving. To the Spanish, the intricate textiles of the Andes were just cloth. But to the Inca women, they were living documents. As they worked the looms, they wove ancient symbols into their designs. The puma for strength, the condor for the divine, the serpent for the underworld. These weren't just decorative patterns. They were a hidden language. They were history, mythology, and identity, all encoded in vibrant threads. A Spanish official might see a beautiful blanket, but an Inca person would see a story of their gods, a map of their cosmos, a reminder of a world the conquerors tried to destroy. Every textile became a secret archive, preserving knowledge right under the noses of the oppressors. The resistance went even deeper, literally into the earth itself. The Inca revered certain stones and natural sites as sacred places, or asterisk, Huacas. Asterisk. The Spanish, seeing this as idolatry, destroyed them. But the women found ways to protect their connection to the sacred. They would secretly bury smaller sacred stones, called canapas, beneath the floors of their new Spanish-style homes, or in the corners of their fields. Outwardly, they might attend Mass in a Catholic church, but inwardly, they knew their true spiritual anchor was hidden just a few feet below, grounding them in their ancestral faith. They learned to practice a dual spirituality, maintaining a veneer of conversion while secretly honoring the old ways. And at night, when the world was still and the guards were out of earshot, another form of resistance would fill the air. Women would gather and sing the ancient hymns, the sacred songs of their people. They sang softly, their voices carrying stories of creation, of the sun god Inti, of the great Inca emperors. These weren't just songs, they were oral histories, prayers, and a direct link to their spiritual world. In a world where their temples were silent, these women turned their own voices into sanctuaries, keeping their faith alive in the dark. Through these seemingly small acts, Inca women became living libraries. They were the storytellers who passed down the epic myths of their people. They were the botanists who preserved the knowledge of herbal medicines, healing their families when Spanish doctors were unavailable or unaffordable. They were the agriculturalists who remembered the ancient techniques of terrace farming, ensuring their communities could still feed themselves. In a world determined to steal everything from them, they fought back with what couldn't be taken. Their memory. Memory became their weapon. Tradition became their shield. The Spanish could seize land, gold, and power, but they could not completely erase the identity that these women carried inside them. They weren't just victims. They were survivors, strategists, and heroes. So what is the legacy of these quiet warriors? Look to the Andes. Today, the spirit of those Inca women is not a relic of the past. It is a living, breathing force. The Quechua language, once whispered in secret, is now an official language in Peru and is spoken by millions. It survived because generations of mothers refused to let it die. The weaving traditions continue, and if you visit a market in Cusco today, you'll see those same ancient symbols woven into magnificent textiles. The patterns are still a language, telling stories of a resilient culture. The stories, rituals, and agricultural wisdom they preserved continue to guide Andean communities. The knowledge of medicinal plants is still used, and their farming techniques help sustain life in the high mountains. The suffering they endured undeniably shaped generations. The trauma of conquest left deep scars, but so did their courage. Their legacy is not one of defeat, but of profound endurance. They remind us that culture is not something that resides only in grand monuments or in the decrees of kings. Culture lives in the language we speak, the food we eat, the stories we tell our children, and the values we hold dear. The true strength of a civilization isn't just in its armies, but in the people, especially the women who carry its soul. The mountains of Peru still echo with the memories of the women who refused to let their culture die. Their story is a powerful testament to the fact that even in the face of overwhelming oppression, the human spirit can find a way to resist, to remember, and to endure. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the heart of Inca resistance. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the hidden corners of history. See you next time.